Hi, this is Simon Obstall and welcome to another tutorial for Resolve Fusion, and today I'd like us to take a look at this sphere blast effect. So let's get into it. So the first thing I want to do is to say a little bit about the tool that we're going to be using to create this effect. And let me just set up a demonstration of this. So I'm going to add a new 3D shape. I'm going to set the size to 10. So this is a plane, and I'm going to rotate it through 90 degrees on X. We'll take a look at that. I'm just going to make this yellow just so it stands out like that. And then I'm going to pick another 3D shape. This time I'm going to make it a sphere. I'm going to set the radius to 0.1. And then to my first 3D shape, this is the plane, I'm going to add the Replicate 3D node. And then I'm going to pipe the sphere into the other input of the Replicate 3D. And if we look at that, you'll see that now what we've got is a grid of spheres. And the density of the grid is determined by the source shape, so this plane here. So if we were to come in and double the number of subdivisions for the plane, you'll see we've got double the number of spheres. And I want to demonstrate something else. So I'm going to add a Displace 3D after the plane, and I'm also going to add a fast noise. And I'm going to take the fast noise into the Displace 3D. I'm just going to crank up the scale a little bit, and you can see that the displacement of the plane now affects the offset of the small spheres. And if I come into the fast noise and I set the seethe rate to 0.25, you'll see we get this sort of interesting dancing grid of spheres. What I'm going to do is just turn that seethe rate down and actually just bypass this displace. And I want to show you something else, which is that if we were to animate the sphere, so I'm going to come into the transform for the sphere, and I'm going to add just a quick expression to the y. And let's go for sine, open brackets, time divided by, say, 36, close brackets. And then if we come into the replicate and we adjust the time offset, so let's go for something like 12, and we press play. Hopefully you can see we've got this sort of sine wave grid wave of spheres. So you can either animate the grid or you can animate the source object, and then if you animate the source object you can use that time offset. And I just want to point out also that what you can do here, I'm just going to switch actually to lighting because it's more pleasant to look at, is you, instead of using a 3D grid, you can actually use a particle emitter. And that means that with this Replicate 3D, you can attach 3D shapes to the particles of a particle emitter. And that's a very useful thing to be able to do as well. But we're getting overcomplicated. We don't want to do any of that. I'm going to come back to this Replicate 3D, turn that time offset down to nothing, back into this shape. Let's remove that expression and set that Y value back down to 0. And I'll turn that displace back on again. So what I'm actually going to do, instead of a plane for our grid, we're going to use an icosphere. And we're going to set the number of subdivisions to 10. And I think you can immediately see what we've got here. Let's add a bit of seethe. Let's go for 0.2. We've got a seething mass of spheres. So I'm sure you can easily see how this is the basis of the effect that we're going to create. So very, very simple to do. So let's just now set up our basic animation. I'm going to come to 35 frames on the timeline, and I'm going to be driving it with this contrast control. So if we set the contrast down to 0, you'll see we've got no effect. So at frame 35, I'm going to keyframe that at 0. I'm going to come forward to frame 40, set that up to 1, then come to frame 60. Let's set it back down to 0. Yeah, let's come to frame 90. So we'll hit a keyframe at frame 90, then we'll come to 95. Set this up to a little bit more this time. Let's go for 1.25. Let's come to 120. Set it back down to 0. And finally, let's come to 150 and keyframe it. Come to 155. Let's set it up to something like 5 this time, so it really flies around. Let's come forward then to 240 and set that back down to 0. So the total animation is going to look something like this. Bounces there, and then does a big sort of explosion there and gradually sinks back down again. And it's probably a good idea to come into the spline editor and just smooth off some of those curves. So this is the basis of our effect. Let's add a rotation to the overall result. So I'm going to add a 3D transform. Let's have a look at that. And let's just drive this with an expression. Let's go for time times 0.2. I just want a very subtle drift around like that. That's pretty good. So when I was setting up my demonstration, I increased this displace scale up to 5, and that is not what I want. Let's reduce that back down to 1, and you see we've got a much tighter grid of spheres now, and that's going to be good for us, I think. So the next thing we can do is, after this 3D transform, is add a camera, which creates a merge like that. Let's add a renderer after that 3D merge and have a look at the renderer. Now what I want to do with my camera is what I normally do, which is to add an expression to the Z pivot, pick whip the Z translation, and add a negative sign to the front of the Z pivot like that, and then set my Z position to 16. So then let's talk about lighting. So I'm going to select this 3D merge, add a 3-point light to it. So I want to make this a little bit yellow, so I'm going to reduce the blue down to 0.8. Let's come to our 3D renderer and turn on the lighting. And if we come to our sort of exploded section here, you'll see we're lighting up from the inside, and that's looking pretty nice. And what I'm actually going to do here is I'm not actually going to light the outside with a light. I'm actually going to adjust the material for my little sphere. So to do that, I'm going to bring in an image map. I've got this image map here, which is an HDRI image that I've grabbed from Polyhaven. It's a free download. There are loads of free HDRIs that you can find on the internet. This sort of studio-based setup is pretty good for the purposes of what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do first of all with this is add a sphere map to it. And that looks like that. Then I'm going to add a reflect shader. Now make sure you don't pipe the sphere map directly into the reflect, because it's not going to give you the right input. So what I'm going to do is actually pick my input, and what I actually want is the color material. So let's look at that, and you can see now we've got this very sort of shiny reflective material like that. I'm going to make life really simple for myself by switching to constant here for the strength variability. Then what I can do is I can pipe that into the material input of the shape, and the overall result is this. So you see now, instead of what we had before, which is black, we're actually now using that to light the exterior of our spheres. So that's all well and good, but it's much too bright, and I just don't want them to be just purely reflective, like they were mirrors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a Cook Torrance shader, and then after the reflect, I'm going to add a material merge, and then I can take my Cook Torrance into the material merge, and then we can blend between the two, you see, like that. So let's go for something like, I don't know, 0.6, and let's just have a look at setting up that Cook Torrance, make the diffuse this sort of color, and let's make the specular a little bit yellow. So then let's add in a background. Over here, we want to merge our renderer output over the top of it, like so. Let's have a look at that. Let's come to the background. Instead of solid color, I want to go for vertical, and I want to add a little bit of red to the top and just a tiny bit of red there, a tiny bit of blue there to the bottom, just so we've got a graduation across the whole thing like that. I've just switched my renderer to the hardware renderer just so it's a little bit easier to play back while I'm making this tutorial. The software renderer is going to look a lot better, but we need to do this just so I can scoot around. So looking back at this major explosion, I wonder whether we can actually just go for something a bit more extreme. So if we come back to our fast noise and let's go to frame 155, Maybe this can be as much as 8 or something. And if also let's increase the detail to 10. Actually, let's maybe even make that, I don't know, 12 or something. Let's go pretty crazy on that. So we've got detail 10, and that keyframe for the contrast is 12. So then I want to add a central core to the effect, so it's revealed once we've seen our explosion. So to do that, I'm going to add a brand new 3D shape. I'm going to set this to sphere. I'm going to set the radius to 0.8, but we're going to animate that eventually. I'm going to add a displace node, and I'm also going to then add a 3D merge. I'm going to take my camera into the 3D merge. I'm going to add a 3D renderer, and that's our sphere there. And then what I want to do is I want to merge it in here. So after this renderer here for the main scene, I'm going to add another merge, and I'm going to take this renderer here and add it in there. So now we don't actually want that sphere to be sitting on top. I actually want it to be sitting inside the overall effect. So to do that, we need to set both renderers output channels to have the Z enabled like that. So for this one, come over to this one and also enable the Z like that. And then if we come back to this merge, switch to channels, we can enable depth merge, and now you see that that's now sitting inside the geometry. So what we can also do is just adjust the merge values. So I don't want any alpha gain, and I think I might also just reduce this value here so we see a little bit through. If you notice, we can now see through. So I'm also going to add down here a fast noise. First of all, I'm going to pipe it into the displace, but I'm also going to use it as the material for the shape. So I'm going to go with the displace scale of 0.5, and back in my fast noise I want to set the detail to 10, the contrast to 3, and the scale to 4. And because my sphere is now looking a bit jagged, I'm going to come in here and set those subdivisions up to say 60 for each. I'm also going to come into the fast noise color and then adjust the alpha a little bit. So I've just adjust that alpha there and this one here, and you can see how much better that's looking. But also obviously we need to adjust the color here, so I'm going to reduce the blue there, and I might also add some red in here. So what we can also do is to this renderer we can add a glow like so, and maybe increase the glow size up to something like 30, and we can adjust the blend on this. If we come to the beginning, so let's try experimenting with setting that blend to 0 at the beginning and keyframe it, and come to our explosion frame, which is 150, maybe set that up to 0.1, so we're just getting a little bit around the edges like that. And then at frame 160, we can set this maybe up to 0.4 even, so we're getting a really nice hot glow there. And then it's come to the last frame and set it to 0, so that just gradually fades away like that. And what we can also do is we can add a glow after the final merge here. So add a glow in like that. Let's look at that. Again, we don't want to actually have this there throughout. So let's come to 150. Let's keyframe the blend down to 0, come forward to 160, set it up to sort of 0.3, and then, I don't know, come back to 240 perhaps, and set it down to 0. So we also want to animate the camera. So let's come to its transform. Let's come to the first frame. Let's keyframe that Z translation. So 16 is good for there. Let's come forward to frame 150. And let's set that amount to 15, which means we're just doing a very slight creep in. Let's then come to 170. And what we want to do here, as the explosion is happening, is to push right in. So I'm going to go for 5 there. And then I'm going to come to frame 240 and set that back to 15. And if we come to the spline, only selected tool, and frame it all up, soften that off by hitting Shift S, soften this one off as well, Shift S. Just eases those two curves. And then let's come to the rotation. So I want to come to frame 150 here, keyframe the Y rotation. And so what I want to do is I want to do a big swing around as the explosion is happening. So what I'm going to do is come to frame 240 and set this to -180. And that's just going to swing us round like this are really going to sort of add to the dynamism of the effect, like so. And again, with that, let's just select the keyframes and Shift S just to soften off that move. And finally, I just want to do a slight animation on this shape here, the internal sort of core, as it were. So I'm going to come to frame 150 again for that. I'm going to keyframe that radius at 0.8. I'm going to step forward to 160 and keyframe it up to 1.2, and then at frame 220 I want to come down to 0.9, and then at frame 300 at the end we will set that back down to 0.5, so it's really sort of disappearing away to nothing. And I also want to drop in a brightness contrast just in here for the fast noise. So let's add a brightness contrast in there, drop it in there, so it's the material input to the shape. And what I want to do is come to the beginning here, keyframe the brightness, set that to something like -0.5. Let's come to frame 160 and set that up to 0, and then come to the end and set it to -0.75. So what that's going to do is just kind of add in that extra sort of richness of colour. It's giving us this really nice sort of fiery look. And so that really is the effect. It's pretty simple. It's really just about finessing all those little details, and it creates something pretty cool, I think. So thanks very much indeed for watching. See you again soon.